This is an overview of the readings for the third module. This module we return to the topic of language endangerment, this time looking at what linguists have said about how we should respond to language endangerment. Under this topic of how we should respond to language endangerment, some linguists have brought up concerns about linguists being involved in work that they see to be, quote, political or social work. Others have suggested that language documentation is a sufficient response to language endangerment without any other activities to help the community preserve their own language. And others have raised more general concerns about whether we really understand enough about language endangerment and about each context and where we work to be able to make any strong statements about how linguists should be responding to language endangerment. These are the references that will be reviewed in this video. The underlined ones are minimum required meetings for discussion in our class. The first two and the last are relatively short readings. The first reading is a publication by Ladefoged, a well-respected phonetician. This reading is published in language. It's published in the same year as the Michael Krauss 1992 paper that we read last week, and is written in direct response to Krauss's piece on language endangerment. Ladefoged responds to the call to action for language maintenance and revitalization by stating that not necessarily all opinions agree that this is the only way to respond to language endangerment, but that there's a diversity of opinion among linguists. In Ladefoged's own experience working in Tanzania, he gives an example of a case where maintaining local languages could be seen as antagonistic to the national government and their socioeconomic development plan, which does not include encouraging the maintenance of local languages. In this context, Ladefoged says to be involved would be too political. Ladefoged also says that speakers are entitled to choose language shift if they would like, and that no speakers of any language are required in any sense to teach their language to their children, and that it would be presumptuous of linguists to say that every language must be maintained. Here's a quote that gives some insight into Ladefoged's position. It is paternalistic of linguists to assume that they know what is best for the community. One can be a responsible linguist and yet regard the loss of a particular language or even a whole group of languages as far from a, quote, catastrophic destruction, quoting back to the Hale et al. Collection in Language 1992. Ladefoged makes a distinction between language documentation on research grounds and involvement in language maintenance or language revitalization in this quote. The case for studying endangered languages is very strong on linguistic grounds. It is often enormously strong on humanitarian grounds as well. But it would be self-serving of linguists to pretend that this is always the case. We must be wary of arguments based on political considerations. Dorian, also publishing in language, in direct response to Ladefoged, counters some of the points that Ladefoged makes. Dorian responds to the view that linguists shouldn't be involved in political activity by stating that all of our activities working with endangered languages have political implications. That is, to choose to not act or to act is already to choose a side in a potential political situation. And that Ladefoged's proposed view that linguists should simply state the facts when dealing with government or public policy is an oversimplification, because the linguistic facts are often subjective, and how they're presented and to whom and what context can also constitute a political act. Furthermore, Dorian does not buy the view that shifting languages is simply a free choice that speakers make, because Dorian states that language shift is triggered by stigmatization, that there's an imbalance in the perceived value of particular languages that's triggering this action by certain speakers who decide to shift to another language. And Dorian further points out that even if a particular generation or a particular person decides of their own volition to move away from their language or not teach their language to their children, it's often the case that later generations come to regret that decision, and later generations may feel the negative effects of moving away from a minority language to a language spoken by more people. Dorian's conclusion is that whether or not the term catastrophic is seen to be appropriate in this context, Dorian believes that every language death is a loss and that this is a position that all linguists should be able to hold. The quote from Dorian: "Scientists of many stripes like to consider their undertakings apolitical and their professional activities objective and impartial. In actuality, linguistic salvage work is inevitably a political act, just as any other act touching that language would be." The discussion on how linguists should respond to language endangerment has continued over the years, including in this rather pessimistic publication from Newman in 2003. The title is "The Endangered Languages Issue as a Hopeless Cause." Newman, somewhat like Ladefoged, affirms that languages should be documented before they are lost and that there's some scientific value in preserving a record of as many languages as possible, but does not believe that linguists should go beyond that to get involved in what Newman terms social work. In other words, there's a distinction made between language documentation and language maintenance or language revitalization. Now, even though Newman is a proponent of language documentation, he remains quite skeptical about where the field of language documentation was at, especially at least back in 2003. Newman was pessimistic about the progress for a number of reasons. Overall, Newman's view is that linguists, particularly those in the United States and Europe, are much more concerned with writing about theories than collecting data, and that the academic system is set up in such a way that theory writing is valued much more than data collection, which is how Newman characterizes language documentation. And related to that is the idea that very few linguists are doing field work. Newman looks at a collection of PhD dissertations in linguistics over a period of time and finds that a very low percentage of the titles of those dissertations point to any fieldwork being done with a minority language or an endangered language anywhere in the world. Newman's position is that for any real progress to be made in documenting languages before they go extinct, there needs to be much more activity by linguists outside of the United States and Europe. That is, linguists need to work on documenting endangered languages that are spoken in their own country. However, for a number of reasons, mostly structural and financial, this is not happening to any significant degree. A quote that helps understand Newman's position is the following: "The primary justification for doing research on an endangered language has to be the scientific value of providing that documentation and of preserving aspects of that language and culture for posterity. The purpose cannot be to make the few remaining speakers feel good." In 2008, Romain is responding to much of this conversation and responding to some of the hesitation to get involved in language maintenance and language revitalization in this paper called "Linguistic Diversity, Sustainability, and the Future of the Past." Romain groups together some of the discussion or the positions around involvement in language maintenance into three different groups. There's the group of people who suggest that we should do nothing in response, the group who suggests that documenting endangered languages is sufficient and there doesn't need to be any involvement in further work to try to change language use patterns. And third, the position that Romain takes, that linguists should be involved in sustaining or revitalizing threatened languages. To those who take the position that we should do nothing in response, Romain critiques this as an oversimplified view that views language change simply as a natural process or choices made in a free market. And Romain's position is that this view doesn't take into account the power differentials and the influences that are there, the pressures on speakers to undergo language shift and to choose to speak a different language. That these need to be taken into account, and that doing nothing in response to this situation is not appropriate. Romain responds to those who say we should only document languages and not get any further involved in language use or language maintenance. Romain reiterates Dorian's position that trying to only do documentation on the grounds that we're somehow being apolitical or objective is, again, oversimplified. It's an idealization of the reality because all of our activities working with minority languages have potential political implications. Further, Romain points out that documentation is only a partial record of languages, that no matter how extensive a documentation corpus is, it's not going to capture everything about a language and how it's spoken and used. And so, even for scientific purposes, language documentation is not a sufficient record of the languages of the world. And that these documentation corpuses can also disappear, as we've seen in some cases in the past, that no matter how good our archiving is, these are not permanent records and there's potential that they could go unused. Romain's position is that we should sustain and revitalize certain languages. There's quite a bit of discussion on how this is motivated by a link between linguistic diversity and biological diversity. And Romain frames the position in terms of maximizing self-determination for language communities. The quote from Romain: "When we lose sight of people and the communities that sustain languages, it becomes easy to argue, as a number of critics have, that there is no reason to preserve languages for their own sake. Maintaining cultural and linguistic diversity is a matter of social justice because distinctiveness in culture and language has formed the basis for defining human identities." The conversation in the literature on how linguists should respond to language endangerment continues, and one example of that is this chapter by Ameka in 2015 in a volume on language documentation and endangerment in Africa. Ameka's characterization of the situation among Africanist linguists is that they are primarily focused on grammatical description, and like Newman, are somewhat skeptical of so-called linguistic social work. Ameka sees that one negative aspect of this is that Africanists have not been as engaged in language documentation because of its association with language maintenance and endangered languages. Ameka wants to distinguish between documentation and making research results of a documentation and description project available to the community from the idea of getting further involved in language maintenance projects or language revitalization projects that go further beyond grammatical descriptive work and the kind of work that's typically done among linguists in academic circles. Ameka finds that descriptivists are not taking advantage of documentation, and that's detrimental to the descriptive work. And so Ameka argues that multimodal language documentation, capturing videos of actual speech, is not just about language maintenance and language revitalization, but it's vital to doing good descriptive work. And that in fact, if we continue in doing documentation only in written form, only in an interview setting, then we end up stifling the the linguistic variation and diversity that we're trying to describe in the descriptive linguistics. Here's a quote summarizing Omeka's position. I will advocate that what is needed for African languages today, major or minor, big or small, described or under-described, is a comprehensive record of diverse genres and registers of actual language use in multimedia with value added through multimodal transcription, annotation, translation, and analysis, all of which are driven by scientifically sound interdisciplinary questions and hypotheses about the unique property of the human species. Notice how this differs from the call to be concerned about the endangered languages for the sake of linguistics. Among those who are proponents of more linguistic involvement in language maintenance and revitalization are Austin and Salabank, who edited this volume together in 2014. Their introductory to the chapter describes a bit of the nature of the field and discussion of beliefs and ideologies in relationship to language use. It provides an overview of different approaches in the literature. They discuss various ideas, but among those are the distinction between vernacular ideologies or the day-to-day, often unspoken, perhaps even subconscious ideologies about language use that speakers have about their own language versus the disciplinary ideologies that field workers, linguists, language documentary workers are trying to implement in their work, and that there's a mismatch between these values, between these ideologies, that can end up in work not having the intended result in terms of trying to actually promote continued language use or language revitalization. Another concept they problematize is the idea of a community, pointing out that it's not always obvious what is meant by a linguistic community, and that there's a slight different emphasis on looking at a linguistic community versus a speech community, and that when linguists work with endangered languages, their interpretation of what they mean by community that they're or who they're targeting in their work can have an effect on their results as well. Alston and Salabank say, ideologies may thus contribute to a mismatch between desired results and methods, and if these ideologies remain unconscious, the reasons why language planning measures are not working may remain undiscovered. Finally, more recently, there was a Target article in Language on the issue of language vitality with several response articles. Target article was written by Mufwene, who summarizes his position with the title that language vitality, the weak theoretical underpinnings of what can be an exciting research area. Mufwene's position is that we do not understand language and document well enough to make strong claims about how to respond to language endangerment today. And one of the main critiques is that the discourse and analysis of language endangerment is not put into the longer history of language change and languages that have been lost in prior centuries or millennia, or into the context of language speciation, that is, the creation of new languages, in particular the creation of creoles and mixed languages. Mufwene also critiques an overemphasis in the literature on indigenous, often meaning non-European, people in theorizing, again pointing out that much of the discussion about language revitalization and endangered languages tends to be focused on a subgroup of languages that doesn't necessarily give us a holistic picture of language change around the world. And Mufwene critiques a number of what he calls simplistic explanations, pointing out that time and time again, when we give explanations for language shift or language loss, we also find cases of exceptions to those rules, that certain things that seem to cause language loss in one context don't cause language loss in another context. To quote Mufwene, regardless of whether we should all, as responsible world citizens, care about language endangerment and loss, I think that linguistics should save itself some embarrassment by theorizing about language vitality more adequately than has been the case to date. Another quote, can we explain to our satisfaction why and how languages die, in the same way that macroecologists can explain how human activity affects our universe negatively? Theoretical developments regarding language vitality lag far behind linguists' current investment in language advocacy. Among the number of response papers that were written to this article, there are two that most directly address language documentation and language endangerment. This one by Campbell from Campbell's position is that Mafwini's exaggerated our lack of understanding of language endangerment and loss, and that in fact the causes of language endangerment have been discussed for quite some time in the literature. These causes are non-linguistic and their effects cannot be easily predicted or fully generalized, which may explain why we don't have comprehensive theories of language endangerment and loss of the kind that Mafwini is looking for. Campbell also points out that there is significant literature on language endangerment among languages of Europe, that the literature is not biased against discussing the situation of European languages. And Campbell further points out that if we want to have the kind of theory that Mafwini is looking for in our understanding of language endangerment and loss, that we need more data, and that the best way to get more data about what's actually happening in language communities is to do language documentation as a method for building comparative studies of language endangerment around the world. And Campbell further points out that language documentation does not need to be seen as something that's at odds with language maintenance and revitalization, as if we need to choose between the two. But in fact, these perspectives on linguistics can be complementary, so that engagement with language documentation can both inform our understanding of language endangerment and loss at a theoretical level, while also having an impact on language maintenance at a more practical level. So a quote from Campbell, documenting a language can also be morally fulfilling, can support and foster language revitalization, and is absolutely necessary for communities concerned with the survival of their languages. The kind of comparison that Mafwini calls for in order to get a broader understanding of language endangerment and loss clearly depends on the actual language documentation projects being done, which collect the correlated ecological metadata such an approach requires. That is, this comparison also is not independent of the language documentation and language revitalization efforts for particular endangered languages. Bauer, well-known linguist at Yale, also responds to Mafwini's article, the paper entitled Theorizing Language Loss Shift Effort. Bauer provides a summary of the major factors in language maintenance and language shift. For example, we know that for language maintenance, there's a need for peer groups among younger speakers. We know that language shift is heavily affected by demographics such as numbers of speakers and their location, as well as economics, and that multilingual education is a fairly well-studied field, even if it's one that's frequently studied by linguists. Darwin points out, as others have done, that language use is not always a free choice, that when speakers undergo language shift, there are often significant pressures on them and factors that are outside of their control. As Campbell has done, Bowen also points out that the literature on language endangerment does include European languages, but further gives some reasons why it may be worthwhile for linguists to focus on non-European post-colonial contexts when discussing language endangerment. Finally, Bowen responds to the idea that speakers can shift to a different language without losing their ethnic identity, and agrees that even though language and ethnic identity are not always in a one-to-one correlation, language is still a key factor and a strong emotional factor in how people view their culture and ethnicity. Here's a quote from Bauer on the state of the field. I argue that there already exists an important literature on theories of language loss, language revitalization, and reclamation that look at these questions from both general modeling perspectives and anthropological or ethnographic ones. We are not flying blind. Another quote from Bauer, this one on the speaker's freedom in making choices about language use. Of course, individuals have choices about what languages they learn and speak, but it would be idle to claim that those choices are free choices. Even when the community-wide attitude toward the language is positive, structural barriers exist that may shape or severely limit speakers' choices. And a final quote from Bowen: work with highly endangered languages is often portrayed as surrounded by the mystique of saving the language. Examples are not hard to find in the media. This is a trope that I think academic linguists reject and are mostly embarrassed by, a view that is offensive to language communities and assumes that no researchers come from indigenous communities, which is false. Such portrayals are embedded, of course, in a history of colonial interaction that intrudes everywhere. Here are some additional readings and collections of articles that you may want to consider if these are issues you want to look at more deeply for any of your assignments.